Sit at the back.
Acting Deputy President, thank you. There'll be some people breathing a sigh of relief that this could be the last time that I address the question of the live export trade, but I just scratch my head and wonder, at the sensibility of some people in the other place. There's a couple of them, including the member for Kennedy, North Queensland cattle industry, and they're actually trying to move a bill to make it illegal to market meat as Australian if the cattle were slaughtered overseas. So they're Australian when they're born, they're Australian when they're bred, they're Australian, but when they go overseas, they're a bit like sending a motor car to the Middle East manufactured in Australia, put the wheels on when it gets to Dubai, driven overseas. That's not Australian, simply because apparently part of it has been undertaken overseas. So that's the sort of nonsense that we're dealing with, Acting Deputy President. But I do want to, for the last time, just confirm a number of points I've made in the past so that people understand it clearly. Because there's always going to be a tax on the live exports of livestock from this country. So I just want to put on record that Australia, of the 109 countries that export live animals around the world, there's only ever been one, there's only one now, and that's Australia, that invests and has invested in people, in training, in welfare, in education, right across the board, to ensure that the standards of husbandry and management and nutrition, all of which go towards welfare, are improved. And Acting Deputy President, again, I just want to remind people of the fact that when these things happen, all the activists, even the RSPCA, it ought to be called the Royal Society of the Protection of Animals in Australia, because they've got no interest in the protection of animals outside of this country. Because when Australian standards are improved for Australian livestock, do you know what happens? The standards lift for all the locally bred and the animals that come from many of those other countries. And I have given demonstrations in Doha during the Festival of Eid in 2012, indicating that animals, instead of going home in the boot of vehicles, they were being processed. The people who bought them got a number, watched the animal being processed, and they took it home in a plastic bag. And what happened to all the other animals from other countries? Acting Deputy President, you guessed it, it was just simply an exam with only one option. Same things happen in Indonesia. Locally bred cattle being processed according to humane Australian standards. But I want to go a bit further, of course, from my own experience as a livestock veterinarian. It's feedlotting of animals here in Australia, it's road transport to the ports, shipping, again the country that leads the world in standards of on-board welfare for animals is Australia, and it is the old story, Acting Deputy President, this is one of the problems. As a human being, we always like to humanise animals. Would I like to stand in a pen with 54 other sheep between here and the Middle East? No, I wouldn't. Therefore, it's wrong. Therefore, it's wrong. We must not ever get to that stage. We've got to look at survivals. We've got to look at the welfare standards, and Australia leads the world, and indeed feedlotting in our target markets, and of course processing. Processing standards, I will be the first to say, have not always been the best, but which is the only country that has continually raised standards? Stunning of cattle is a prime example. So those are points I wanted to make in that space. Mr Acting Deputy President, I don't want to dwell on the shocking ban of live exports back in 2011, but I stood in this place and I said at that time, heaven forbid, the calves from last year should be on ships going to Indonesia, because the calves from this year, their mothers with the mothers in calf, competing on the rangeland for the food. And I made the prediction in 2011, you remember it well, Acting Deputy President, I said, heaven forbid, if we have a drought or if we have a bushfire that wipes out the feed on the rangelands, not only will we see devastation of the rangelands environmentally, we are going to see cattle die in their tens, if not hundreds of thousands. And what happened? And where were the activists, Acting Deputy President? Where was the RSPCA standing up and saying, we take responsibility for the death by starvation of those animals on the rangelands? They were nowhere. They were nowhere. The word was said, and I don't like to say this in Parliament, but I do have to accurately record it. One of them said to me, shit happens. Does it really? So that was the circumstance, because regrettably, as we all know, both drought and bushfire followed in that particular season. Acting Deputy President, I want to go to this question about the need to process everything in Australia, because we're only then going to protect the meat processing industry. These are the statistics. 92% of all beef cattle in this country are processed domestically. And of course, 2/3 of them go as hamburger meat to the United States of America. We're the second biggest exporter of beef in the world. Not the second biggest producer, the second biggest exporter. So 8% of animals go in the live export trade. And you'd think the member for Kennedy, if he comes from North Queensland and understood it better, and I was at University College with him in the 60s, so I've known him for many years, the simple fact of the matter is twofold. First of all, it is the live export trade that creates the competition in the market so that producers get a fair return. And the second point is, over the years in Queensland, whatever the seasons have been, whether they've been good, whether they've been bad, do you know that 92%, 8% remains absolutely consistent? And let me make this other point, because there are people who say, oh, well, if we didn't have live exports, we would simply be able to sell the meat to those markets. Well, the two examples I'll give you, of course, Saudi Arabia. When we lost the live export trade to Saudi Arabia, do you think beef and sheep sales, meat sales doubled? Acting Deputy President, they didn't. They were obliterated. We had none. Again in 2011, when we lost the live export trade for a period of time and the number of cattle that year, live cattle, going to Indonesia halved, logic would tell you, wouldn't it? If we can sell the beef instead of the live animals, what would have happened to the sales of beef to Indonesia that year, Mr. Acting Deputy President? Yep, you got 1 out of 1 again. They also halved. The two trades have always been very, very complementary. One opens the market to the other. But please let me remind you, the 4 million sheep that go into Saudi Arabia every year now, some of them on jumbo jet 747s that come in from other countries, of which we used to sell 3 million sheep. When I was in the trade in the 1980s, we would sell up to 3 million sheep, not one coming from Australia now. Do you think the whole trade stopped? Do you think the Saudi market said, oh, look at those Australians. They've stopped selling to us, therefore we're going to stop eating sheep meat. What a load of nonsense. The simple fact of the matter is they've gone and sourced them from other countries, and their standards may not be the standards that we in Australia have implemented over time. So the loss of trade means the loss of animal welfare standards around the world. How do the activists explain that? Because they simply cannot. The lack of understanding, said by a young woman from the activist organisation in 2013, not 2 years after the trade was banned. And I quote what she said, "It is disappointing to continue to hear that the 5-week suspension to Indonesia in 2011 is still being blamed for issues facing the industry in 2013. You bet they were. Suicides, bankruptcies, not only of the pastoralists, but those who supported them, trucking companies, helicopter companies, other supporting companies. You bet the impact was it's being held today, still being felt to this day. How disappointing that somebody would be so naive and so ignorant. And it doesn't allow me the opportunity today, Acting Deputy President, as you know, to talk about when that ban hit, because that ban hit at the top of the expenditure curve when all the money was out there being spent, and the bottom of the revenue curve. The last time they'd seen a dollar was October last year, 2010. When did the ban come on? When did that ABC footage get released? The end of May. Right at the... Haven't had a dollar. No revenue for 6 months. Top of the expenditure curve, bang! Now, if that was a coincidence, I tell you what, I'm Uncle Billy's uncle, and I certainly am not. The live export trade underpins the meat processing trade. Let me give you 2 examples from our home state of Western Australia. These are actual sale prices of sheep, and it shows you the impact of the live export trade. At a time when the live export trade was ceased, one of my associates managed to get $44 for a line of rams. When the live export trade resumed, he was getting $120 for an equivalent line of rams, 3 times the price. And indeed, for ewes, $15 without the trade, $60 with the trade. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. And I finished my contribution with the statistics from the Department of Agriculture, July to December of last year. Cattle, 99.88% of cattle arrived safely, a 0.12% mortality. That's better than being on the rangeland. Sheep, 98.89%, 1.2% mortality, 99.89% survival. Let me finish my contribution by telling you what the actual mortality rate for human beings in Australia is. It is 0.6%. That's the annual figure. Cattle deaths on these ships, 0.12, sheep 2%, and indeed 1.2%, humans
Senator
0.6
Back, your time has
of 1%.
expired.